trauma is something that changes the way that your brain functions.
Everybody at some point in their life went through a traumatic event. So we're going to talk about trauma today. And I really want to emphasize, happened to me. We think of trauma always being this extreme event, like something dramatic, some really bad accident, something that was super obviously impactful. That's trauma. And it doesn't have to be. My childbirth was very traumatic, and I did not realize until years later when I'm dealing with consequences of the physical impact that it had on me and really also the mental psychological impact on it. That was traumatic, and I had to really heal from that trauma. And I didn't realize that that was really a traumatic event. And then I had a couple other ones. My third one wasn't any better either. But the key is we're going to talk about trauma today, mainly the signs in this episode. It's a two-part episode. So this one is all about signs and symptoms. There's another video that we have for strategies. But today it's all about signs and symptoms of trauma, and a lot of them that you may not recognize as, being maybe traumatic event, and maybe you need to look into what happened in your life that may be more traumatic than you think. Let's say it this way. Well, I'm Heike Fallon. I'm a personal high performance coach, and I help my clients with self-leadership with a brain-based approach to be really better leaders. And oftentimes, really, honestly, everybody at some point in their life went through a traumatic event.
Hi, I'm Shannon Passalacqua, and I am also a high performance coach. And I specify, or I work with women who have been through miscarriages, which also can be very traumatic. And I think most people don't realize the trauma that it and the impact that it has on your body and your brain. So do you want to talk about what exactly trauma is? Because from my research and from what I learned over my past, over the past few years, is trauma is something that changes the way that your brain functions. So it doesn't need to be, like you said, it doesn't need to be a huge thing that happened to you. Like we always think of trauma. I think our society thinks of trauma as like, oh, I went to war and I came back with PTSD, or I had a huge accident and I almost died, or whatever. Trauma is anything that changes the way that your brain functions.
Yes, and it's not just psychological, emotional. It manifests oftentimes physiological. So in our body. That's where we always say the body keeps the score.
Yeah.
It
really does.
It really does. And so oftentimes, that's what I experienced, the physical component where it keeps stuck in your body, showing up in different forms. We'll talk about it in a sec, but that is trauma too. So even though I felt psychologically, emotionally not too derailed, because I think I have a really good support system, but the physical component, and I did not realize for years that was actually trauma. So in my case, I like to share that really quick, was my first delivery was horrifying. It was just super long, 24 hours, and even the nurses were surprised how the contractions would stay like 15 minutes long, and on the monitor it wouldn't, it's supposed to go down.
Oh, no.
It would stay long. I was shaking. They had to put me on oxygen. It was just horrifying. And then my kiddo being a little bigger framed, didn't know where to put the shoulders, ripped me completely apart. And I ended up having full incontinence with nerve damage, and so that was traumatic. Then I had to have bladder surgery, which was again traumatic, which I didn't realize. Then I had chronic bladder infections, went from urologist to urologist, which they couldn't help me. But every time they went in with cameras to look around and try to see whatever they can see. And that was felt at some point traumatic and stressful. Just I got to the point like nobody's looking inside my bladder with anything anymore. I'm like,
Stay
you've
away.
seen it all. I can't handle it anymore. I realized like I can't handle it anymore. So, but and then I had a fairly easy middle son delivery, and my last one was a C-section, which they couldn't get the IV in my arm, so the whole thing started already massively uncomfortable, me crying because couldn't get that in. And then the C-section itself, I have to say, felt very awful because you're not fully out, so you do know they're doing stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm just
I wouldn't like
a
that.
visual person, and I'm just visualizing them cutting me open.
Yeah.
So
That would not go well with me.
then I dealt for years and years with chronic bladder infections, but my infection, which then most doctors don't understand, turned into really, really massively painful, like super painful, until I realized it's all the stored traumatic events that just anytime anything feels uncomfortable in the lower abdominal areas, it just triggers and comes back. And when I realized that is trauma, then I started addressing it differently. But I didn't think about it as trauma for years. So
yeah. Well, and same for me when I went through my miscarriages, it was doctor after doctor after doctor, miscarriage after miscarriage after miscarriage. And I think when we're at this heightened level of stress for such a long period of time, it really changes how we're showing up, right? Our brains are just kind of like at that heightened stress. We're just continuously thinking about those things. So that changes our brain waves. And I didn't recognize it as trauma. When I was, going through this, I didn't think trauma was anything except for a bad accident or a near-death experience. And so I didn't think that my miscarriages were considered trauma until, like you said, later on, when I just kept having all of these weird things happen where I was like, no, I never used to have anxiety. I never used to I went from this person who was always going out and wanting to be social and to someone who didn't want to be social. I was sick all the time. I had a lot of digestive issues. And it wasn't until I don't know what book I read. It might have been The Body Keeps the Score. It might have been that book that made me realize all of my grief and all of that was considered trauma.
Yeah. And like you said, fatigue, right? Sleep issues are common signs as well. The aches and pains that oftentimes back problems can be related to trauma, but again, it depends on what your history is, right? Just muscle tension. That's what they kept telling me too, which yes, was true. Oh, it's just muscle spasms, right? And I'm like, yeah, great. And how do I deal with that? Then there was never really an answer. How do we deal with that, right? But I think too is that you might start on one end, like you said, anxiety, like I was and depression, and sometimes certain things it kind of starts this domino effect. So I had pain. Because of the pain, I wouldn't sleep well enough because I would wake up in the middle of the night. Then I didn't sleep well. That caused me being overly tired. Then that also caused me to be lower energy, and then you don't go out or do as much stuff. So it kind of sometimes triggers, and it's kind of hard to see what came first.
For me, when I'm tired, I also don't eat as well, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm just like, I don't have the energy to cook anything that's, has nutrients in it. And so I just grab it, whatever. And that's a bad cycle that gets into, an issue because now your gut microbiome is all messed up and you're eating crappy food, which is draining your energy. And then again, you're not sleeping well. And so it's just this cycle that you get into. And it's, you got to pull yourself out of it, which we'll talk about, in another video.
But I like to jump on this because as we talked in other times as well, because it ended up for me like 7 urologists later, I'm like, forget about this, right? You guys can't figure out why I'm getting bladder infections. And I had like 300 or something. I lost count. I stopped. I had a printout from the pharmacist who gave me like, I said, I want to know. It was like 280. And then after that, I know I hit the 300 at some point, but I stopped counting because it made me sick. But here's the thing. I finally said, you know what? It's not the bladder. It can't be the bladder. It's something else. And again, talking about domino effect, my system just got so weak and couldn't handle, like my immune system got so weak over time. Of course, the antibiotic didn't help. And I wish I would have known what I know now. Yes, I needed it, but I could
It
have
ruins your
done
gut.
certain things otherwise. But yeah, it totally destroyed my gut, 100%. But nobody told me, nobody made me aware of it until it was all screwed up. And I'm trying to figure that one out. But any traumatic event does, like you said, compromises the brain, but also compromises our cell structures. So we talked about mitochondria before, which are the small cell structures that are very important for energy production, and they do get compromised. And I think at the end of the day, I ended up going to a holistic doctor, walked in the office and said, just test everything you can test because I need to figure out it's something else, right? Ended up that in a test showed up gluten sensitive. So I stopped eating gluten. All of the diet changes that I started doing to actually rehabilitate my immune system was what ended up doing that. But the point is that I never felt a stomach pain or anything like that. So that wasn't a symptom for me. So sometimes certain symptoms are not necessarily directly correlating to what the actual strategies will be. So sometimes we need to really think broader, but not right now. We're skipping that one. So sticking to signs and symptoms. Share a little bit more, because I know for you it was the mental component very strong, right? So the signs and symptoms that really more the mental and behavioral symptoms that signs and symptoms that show up.
Yeah, and we talk about this a little bit in you interviewed me for about miscarriages. But like I said in that interview, I kind of just swept everything under the rug when I was going through my miscarriages. And I didn't recognize that I was going through all of this grief. I never really acknowledged it. I never thought that it was going to affect me. I totally ignored it. I completely ignored it. And just the next month was like, I'm just going to try to get pregnant again. I'm going to cry today. Then tomorrow we'll focus on how to get pregnant again. And I just kept sweeping that under the rug, and I kept sweeping that under the rug, and that just makes for a lumpy rug. If you don't work through your grief. And so, I did end up getting pregnant and had my second son, and then had 2 miscarriages after that. And again, at that point, I still didn't understand that I needed to grieve. I still didn't understand that I needed to work through the trauma, work through the grief. It was not a thing that I understood. And so I just ignored it again and just kind of went back to my normal life, except things weren't back to normal. I never really found my old self. I really had to rediscover a new version of myself. But it took a lot of work for me to get there. And what made that happen was, I was going to work, coming home and just crawling in bed and pretty much just ignoring everything else. I pulled away from my family. I had anxiety that I never had before. I couldn't sleep. I was having a lot of sleep issues. There was just a lot that I would say it was a mild depression that I didn't recognize as a mild depression. And I just kind of kept just ignoring it. And then at some point I was like, this isn't normal. Like, I used to feel vibrant about life.
Yeah.
I used to go through life happy. And so I was like, what's going on? What is it why am I not feeling that anymore? And, I was I was drinking because I thought, okay, well, I'm stressed, I'll drink wine. And so that helped me ignore any pain as well.
Not the
You know,
greatest
like
strategy.
it is not a strategy, friends. Don't, I mean, I know we all like our glass of wine or whatever, but honestly, like, you know, I tell this all the time where when I was going through my miscarriages, I had a setup. Like I had had so many miscarriages that I knew exactly like I'm gonna go, oh, I'm having another miscarriage. I'm gonna crawl in bed. I'm gonna get my tissue. Gonna get my Advil. And I'm gonna get my wine.
Yeah.
And I would just lay in bed for a couple days while my miscarriage happened, and that's what I would do: drink, cry, take my Advil. Um, and again, like I said, I never worked through it until years later.
Yeah, but you
I
also mentioned it's
realized,
like a lot of shame, right?
yeah,
Self-blame and shame happens, and not just miscarriages or the trauma events that I had happen, but like any trauma.
yeah.
Oftentimes
Well, I think you think that you can handle it all. You're supposed to be able
post,
to handle it all. And that was something that I kept telling myself is I can do this. I can handle it. I'm supposed to be able to handle this. Just like I'm supposed to be able to get pregnant and stay pregnant. And so you blame your body, you shame yourself, you shame your body, you shame everything that happens. And so it's just a cycle that just keeps happening. And it comes out in other ways, right? Like it manifests in different ways in your life. And if you don't deal with the trauma at the time, years later, something is going to happen. You're going to get sick. You're going to have like sleep issues, anxiety, depression, and you're not going to know what it's related to.
yeah, because it can be years and years before you realize that that was connected to an
Hmm.
event long time ago.
Hmm. And
And
then you just have to do that work then.
yeah, and I think too, like there literally any emotional spectrum is possible, right? And oftentimes, so I realized too when I learned more about trauma is a lot of these things could be other reasons too, right? The
Yeah.
lack of sleep could be another reason besides trauma. It's all these symptoms, signs and symptoms overlap with other things
Hmm.
as well. So it's kind of hard.
Right. So it's easy to blame it on something else.
It's easy to blame it on something else, which, it's just when I got stuck and it wouldn't move forward and the doctors weren't
Mhm.
able to help me. That's when I went out and tried to find answers that I realized that is really, very traumatic what
Hmm.
happened and that I need to address it differently. But a lot of those signs and symptoms, again, from, anxiety, depression, shame, lack of focus can be as well
Hmm.
the case, right? Concentration issues. You said denial, right? The shock and denial kind of phases,
Pulling away from
pulling
your
away
loved
the whole
ones.
social component, right? Not feeling to socializing, kind of removing yourself from any socializing, impacting relationships, and that whole physical component that we just talked about, right? From the aches and pains to sleep to all of those type of things. All of those can have different reasons too, and that's what makes it so difficult, right? Like it
Yeah.
could be, as we talked about, it could be hormones. It could
It could be
be
hormones. It
other
could be,
other underlying issues that are going on. It doesn't mean it has to be trauma, but that's when really it becomes a little difficult to analyze the signs and symptoms. And the truth is, for the doctors, it's very difficult to know because honestly, they don't have time enough to talk to you and know your whole history.
right, right.
And that's why it's very important to check in with yourself and realize, what and sit down and think of like, okay, what paying attention to these signs and symptoms and see where correlations are and patterns. um but I also think it's very important to understand, and I can't emphasize that enough, for somebody else whatever happened to you might
Yes.
not be a traumatic event, and
Well,
that
and that's what I was going to say is I find it so interesting to know like why does one event affect someone differently than You know, like I know a lot of people who've had miscarriages and it didn't affect them like it affected me.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that I'm wrong with the way that I reacted. I just wonder what it is, like what's different in everyone's brains
Yeah.
to say, okay, like this trauma affected me. This other event didn't affect me. What is it? Like I know, and I think they're researching it. I think they're looking into it. I just find it really interesting. But like you were saying, just because it doesn't affect someone else doesn't mean that it's not going to affect you. And so you got to give yourself a lot of grace and
And
I
others,
mean,
and others, and
yeah,
others, because I
yes,
say if I went through something that was maybe impactful, but it didn't manifest as real trauma to me, just because the other person went through it
right,
doesn't mean they're sensitive or weak or something. That's not true.
right.
It's not weakness. It's just their system, their whole brain body
Mm-hmm.
system responded differently to it, because nobody is the same here. We may have
Right.
similar experiences, but we're not the same. Every system is unique. Everybody is unique. And we have to just acknowledge that we are unique and have more empathy and grace for ourselves and
Yeah.
for others.
I have a friend who had a miscarriage and we talk about this a lot because she knows the work that I do. And she had a miscarriage and it didn't affect her. But she is always so respectful of what I went through. And she
Yeah.
always gives me so much grace to feel the feelings that I had. And she completely understands, like, you know, for her it wasn't a big deal. But for me, it was. And we talk about that and how it affected us differently. And it's respecting other people and what they're experiencing. And everyone experiences things differently.
Absolutely. And with that, I'm going to say watch the other episode coming up, which is really strategies on how to heal trauma. And we're going to go a little deeper into that. This was all about signs and symptoms and starting that awareness of maybe things that are going on
Mm-hmm.
are related to some traumatic events, and they may not be the big typical events that we know of being traumatic. That might be even things like bullying, or
Yeah. Oh,
social
yeah.
media, or racism or discrimination. All those things can be traumatic for other people because everybody's different. So all those type of things have an impact as well. So there might be other things that happen into your life that may be traumatic for you.
To you.
To you. Thank you. Traumatic to you, that I always don't like it because it does it to you.
I know. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
feels traumatic for you.
For
That's
you.
what I want to say.
In you.
I'm changing the language. But it may be sometimes things that, again, where other people say, hey, no big deal. No, for you it is. And if it is for you, you need to address it and heal from it.
Right. And we'll talk about those strategies in the next episode.
Awesome. Thank you, Shannon.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.